On March 15, 2004, little Esperanza Castillo, only 8 years old, vanished without a trace from the cruise ship Caribbean Princess while it sailed through the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For a decade, her family endured the most devastating uncertainty a human being can experience, not knowing whether her daughter was still alive or dead. But in 2014, her brother Eduardo made a discovery that would change everything forever, finding something that investigators, the federal police, and even Interpol had overlooked for years. What he found through a simple Facebook search would not only unravel the mystery, but reveal a truth so disturbing that it would cast doubt on everything they thought they knew about the case. How is it possible for a little girl to completely vanish from a ship in the middle of the ocean, only to reappear years later living an entirely different life? Before we continue with this unsettling story, if you value real mysterious cases like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new cases. And tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. We're curious to know where our community is spread across the world. Now, let's discover how it all began. Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco. In 2004, it was a city that lived mainly off international tourism. Middle-class Mexican families, like the Castillos, very rarely could afford a cruise vacation. But Alejandro Castillo had worked for 3 years as a supervisor in a construction company to save enough money and fulfill his wife Dolores' dream of an unforgettable family vacation. The Castillo family was made up of Alejandro, 38 years old, a hard-working, methodical man who grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of Guadalajara; Dolores, 35 years old, an elementary school teacher at a public school in Puerto Vallarta, known for her absolute dedication to her students; Eduardo, 16 years old, a responsible teenager who already worked weekends at a mechanic shop to help with family expenses; and little Esperanza, 8 years old, an extraordinarily sociable girl with the unique ability to make friends wherever she went. Esperanza was the kind of child neighbors fondly remembered. She had dark brown hair, always neatly tied in 2 pigtails her mother made for her every morning, and big brown eyes that seemed to shine when she smiled. She was slim for her age, but strong and agile, qualities she developed playing in the cobblestone streets of downtown Puerto Vallarta, where they lived in a 2-story house Alejandro had inherited from his parents. The decision to take the cruise had not been financially easy. The 5-day trip through the Mexican Caribbean, with stops in Cozumel and Mérida, cost about 35,000 pesos for the whole family, a considerable sum for the Castillo's income. But Dolores insisted it was crucial to create family memories, especially since Eduardo would soon graduate from high school and possibly move to Guadalajara to study engineering. The family culture of the Castillos reflected the typical values of Mexican working-class families: respect for elders, shared responsibility in caring for younger siblings, and a solid work ethic. Eduardo, though only 8 years older than Esperanza, had taken on a protective role toward his younger sister since he was very young. It was common to see them walking to school together, Eduardo carrying Esperanza's backpack while she chatted about her classes or friends. In 2004, the Puerto Vallarta community still had that big-town atmosphere where most families knew each other. The Castillos had lived in the same house for 15 years in the Colonia Centro, just 6 blocks from the boardwalk. Their neighbors described them as a united, hard-working family. Alejandro was known for his punctuality and honesty at work, while Dolores was respected by the parents at Benito Juarez Elementary, where she had taught 2nd grade for 12 years. In Mexican culture at that time, the idea that something bad could happen to a child during a family vacation was almost inconceivable. Families trusted that tourist areas, especially those oriented toward families with children, had adequate security measures. This trust, which would later prove naive, was an integral part of the social mentality of the era. The Caribbean Princess cruise ship departed from Puerto Vallarta on Sunday, March 14, 2004 at 6:30 p.m. The ship, operated by Princess Cruises, had a capacity for 3,080 passengers and 100 crew members. The Castillos had booked an interior cabin on Deck 8, which, although it had no ocean view, was what they could afford within their budget. The first day went by normally. The family explored the ship. Eduardo was fascinated by the video game center, while Esperanza was enchanted with the children's pool and the kids' activity area called Kids Club. Dolores meticulously documented every moment with her Kodak digital camera, an investment she had made specifically for the trip. The routine of the second day, March 15, began normally. According to Dolores's testimony recorded in the police report, the family had breakfast at the main buffet around 8:30 a.m. Esperanza was particularly excited because special children's activities had been announced for that afternoon, including a pirate treasure hunt scheduled to start at 2 p.m. After breakfast, the family went to the upper deck to sunbathe. Eduardo stayed at the main pool, reading a car magazine he had bought on board, while Esperanza and Dolores relaxed on lounge chairs under an umbrella. Esperanza played in the children's pool under her mother's direct supervision until about 11:15 a.m. At that time, according to later testimonies, Esperanza asked her mother for permission to go to the bathroom. Dolores told her to use the restroom on Deck 9, just 2 levels away, which she had already used several times. The girl knew the way perfectly and had proven to be responsible moving around the ship the day before. Dolores waited about 10 minutes before starting to get worried. She knew her daughter and knew that Esperanza never took more than 5 minutes in the bathroom, especially when activities she was excited about were waiting. At 11:30 a.m., Dolores asked Eduardo to go look for his sister. Eduardo systematically checked the restrooms on Deck 9, asked the cleaning staff if they had seen a girl matching her description, and then expanded his search to adjacent decks. At 11:45 a.m., he returned to his parents without having found any trace of her. The family's search immediately intensified. Alejandro went to the ship's reception, while Dolores and Eduardo combed through all the public areas accessible to children. At 12:15 p.m., when it was evident that Esperanza wasn't in any logical place she could have been, Alejandro officially reported the disappearance to cruise security. The Caribbean Princess's security protocol, according to documents later made public during the investigation, required an immediate response to the disappearance of a minor. At 12:30 p.m., the ship's internal Amber Alert was activated, meaning all crew members had to suspend non-essential activities and join the search. The first phase involved 45 crew members systematically searching all public areas of the ship: restaurants, game rooms, shops, theaters, and all recreational spaces. At the same time, the security team reviewed surveillance footage between 11 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. One of the first important clues came from the security cameras. The footage clearly showed Esperanza walking alone down the Deck 9 hallway at 11:18 a.m., heading toward the restroom area. However, the cameras did not cover the inside of the bathrooms or the back corridor connecting to the crew service areas. At 2:15 p.m., when the initial search had yielded no results, the ship's captain, James Morrison, decided to contact the Mexican maritime authorities. At that moment, the ship was about 195 nautical miles southwest of Cozumel, in Mexican waters. The technical investigation revealed a disturbing detail. There was a window of approximately 12 minutes between 11:18 and 12:30 a.m., during which Esperanza did not appear on any surveillance cameras and had not been specifically recalled by any passenger or crew member. Maritime protocol required the ship to remain in its current position until Mexican authorities arrived. At 4:30 p.m., a Navy vessel reached the cruise ship with a specialized investigation team trained for disappearances at sea. Over the next 8 hours, while the ship remained stopped in the middle of the ocean, the most exhaustive search in Princess Cruises' history was conducted. By the end, every cabin on the ship had been inspected, every service area checked, and every passenger and crew member who had been on decks 8, 9, and 10 during that time interviewed. Maritime investigators found something that added a new dimension to the mystery. In the service area behind the restrooms on Deck 9, there was an access door leading to the crew's working corridors. This door, which normally had to be locked, had been found unsecured during the initial search. The formal investigation began when the cruise ship returned to Puerto Vallarta in the early morning of March 16. Mexican authorities, led by federal prosecutor Ricardo Salinas, established an operations center at the port facilities. The first thing that caught investigators' attention was the meticulous record-keeping of passengers and crew. Everyone who had boarded the ship had complete documentation, including passport, Mexican ID, and in the case of crew members, work history and background checks. The forensic analysis of the surveillance cameras extended beyond the day of the disappearance. The investigators reviewed recordings from the 3 previous days, searching for any unusual interaction between Esperanza and other passengers or crew members. This analysis revealed that the girl had made casual contact with several people during the trip, but nothing that seemed suspicious or out of the ordinary for a sociable 8-year-old. One line of investigation focused on the crew. The Caribbean Princess employed citizens from 23 different countries, many of them with temporary work contracts. The Mexican investigative team requested international cooperation through Interpol to verify the backgrounds of all crew members, a process that would take several weeks. At the same time, an investigation into the passengers began. The 3,080 passengers were categorized into different risk groups based on criteria such as single male travelers, people with known criminal records, and those who had documented interactions with Esperanza during the trip. The testimony of the Castillo family was recorded on video on March 17th. During this 6-hour interview, each family member recounted their activities and observations in the days prior to the disappearance. Eduardo, in particular, provided valuable information about his sister's routines and the people she had interacted with. One of the most disturbing details that emerged during these testimonies was that Esperanza had mentioned to her family that she had made a new friend on the first day of the cruise. According to Dolores's notes, the girl had said that the Candyman had promised to show her where they kept the ship's special ice creams. This information led to a specific investigation of the cruise ship's food and beverage department. However, all employees in this department were interviewed and subjected to background checks, with nothing suspicious found. The maritime search continued for 5 days after the disappearance. The Mexican Navy deployed 3 vessels and a helicopter to patrol the waters within a 200 nautical mile radius around the point where the ship had been when the disappearance was reported. This search, which cost approximately 2.8 million pesos, produced no physical evidence. One theory that gained strength among the investigators was the possibility that Esperanza had accidentally fallen overboard. However, a technical analysis of the ship's railings and safety measures showed that it would have been physically impossible for a child of Esperanza's height to accidentally fall from any passenger-accessible area. The investigation also considered the possibility that the girl had hidden somewhere on the ship and died from some kind of accident, with her body remaining concealed in an inaccessible area. A specialized team from the Finnish shipbuilding company that had constructed the vessel was brought in to carry out a complete technical inspection of all the ship's structural areas. This inspection, which lasted 3 days, found no indication that Esperanza had been in spaces not intended for passengers. The most promising line of investigation came from analyzing the ship's communications. Records showed that during the period of the disappearance, 2 phone calls had been made from the ship to numbers in Mexico that could not immediately be identified. One of these calls had lasted 47 seconds and had been made from an internal phone located in the service area of Deck 9, exactly where the unlocked door had been found. However, when investigators tried to trace these numbers, they discovered that both had been disconnected from the telephone system on the very same day as the disappearance. The Mexican telephone company provided records showing that both numbers had been registered with false documentation. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the Mexican investigation had interviewed 1,247 people, reviewed more than 340 hours of video footage, and spent resources equivalent to 8.5 million pesos. Despite this massive effort, no solid evidence had been found regarding the whereabouts of Esperanza Castillo. The case was officially classified as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances and remained open, with periodic reviews every 6 months. Princess Cruises implemented new security protocols as a direct result of this case, including mandatory escorts for minors under 12 years old in certain areas of the ship and an electronic identification system for children. The return to Puerto Vallarta marked the beginning of the darkest period in the Castillo family. The house, once filled with Esperanza's laughter, became a silent place where every corner reminded them of the missing girl. Dolores stopped teaching. The principal of Benito Juarez Elementary granted her an indefinite leave, but after 6 months it became clear she could not return to being surrounded by children Esperanza's age. The trauma had fundamentally altered her ability to function in situations that reminded her of her lost daughter. Alejandro buried himself obsessively in work. He began taking double shifts and working weekends, not so much out of financial necessity, but because constant activity was the only way to keep at bay the thoughts of what might have happened to Esperanza. His coworkers noticed that he had developed the habit of compulsively checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for a call that never came. Eduardo, who was 16 when his sister disappeared, experienced the impact in a different but equally devastating way. He developed an irrational sense of guilt, convincing himself that if he had accompanied Esperanza to the bathroom, none of this would have happened. This feeling of responsibility deeply affected his future plans. Instead of moving to Guadalajara to study engineering, as he had intended, Eduardo decided to stay in Puerto Vallarta to be close to his parents. He enrolled in the Puerto Vallarta Institute of Technology to study computer systems, a field that would allow him to help in the search for Esperanza using the internet and technology. The first anniversary of the disappearance was especially difficult. Dolores had preserved Esperanza's room exactly as it had been, including the clothes she had left out for the next day of the cruise. The room became a sort of sanctuary where Dolores would spend hours sitting, surrounded by her daughter's memories. The Puerto Vallarta community responded with remarkable support. Neighbors organized weekly prayer groups, and the local Sacred Heart Church dedicated a special mass every month for Esperanza's return. These acts of solidarity provided some comfort to the family, but they also served as constant reminders of their loss. As the years passed, the family had to face difficult decisions about how to move forward with their lives. In 2006, 2 years after the disappearance, Alejandro and Dolores consulted a grief specialist psychologist to determine whether they should legally declare Esperanza dead. However, the absence of any evidence of death made such a decision impossible. Eduardo became the most active family member in keeping the search alive. During his computer system studies, he learned to use internet tools that were new at the time. In 2005, he created a website dedicated to the search for Esperanza, with updated photographs showing what she might look like as she grew older. The emergence of social media changed the dynamics of the search. When MySpace became popular in Mexico around 2006, Eduardo created profiles on every available platform, using different combinations of Esperanza's name and possible surnames she might be using if she had been adopted or changed her identity. In 2008, 4 years after the disappearance, the family received the first of what would become many false alarms. A woman in Guadalajara contacted the authorities claiming she had seen a girl matching Esperanza's description. The subsequent investigation revealed it was a case of mistaken identity, but the process reopened emotional wounds that had barely begun to heal. These false alarms became a devastating pattern. Every few months, someone reported seeing Esperanza in different Mexican cities. Each report required investigation. Each investigation generated renewed hopes, and each negative conclusion deepened the family's despair. Dolores developed a daily routine that included checking websites for missing children, not only Mexican ones, but international as well. She had become an expert in recognizing human trafficking patterns and had established contact with search organizations in the United States, believing that it was possible that Esperanza had been taken across the border.
The marital relationship between Alejandro and Dolores was severely affected. Statistics show that 80% of marriages do not survive the disappearance of a child, and the Castillos were no exception. In 2009, 5 years after the disappearance, Alejandro temporarily moved in with his brother. Although they never formalized a legal separation, Eduardo had become not only the son, but also the emotional mediator between his parents. At 21 years old, he had taken on responsibilities that would have been overwhelming for many adults. He worked part-time at a technology company and used his income to keep the internet search updated, paying for Google ads and maintaining multiple websites dedicated to finding Esperanza. The evolution of Facebook once again changed the search strategies. When this platform began to gain popularity in Mexico around 2009, Eduardo immediately recognized its potential. Facebook not only allowed for more sophisticated searches, but also made it possible for people with information to contact the family directly. Eduardo developed a systematic methodology for using Facebook in the search. Every week, he dedicated at least 10 hours to searching for profiles that might correspond to Esperanza, using different combinations of names, approximate ages, and geographic locations. He also joined missing persons groups and began building a network of contacts with other families in similar situations. By 2010, 6 years after the disappearance, Eduardo had developed a database with more than 2,000 Facebook profiles that he had identified as possible matches. None of these profiles had turned out to be Esperanza, but the process gave him a sense of actively doing something to find his sister. The family also had to deal with scammers who tried to take advantage of their desperation. On 3 different occasions, people contacted the Castillos, claiming to have information about Esperanza in exchange for money. These experiences, besides being emotionally devastating, also resulted in significant financial losses before the family learned to verify the legitimacy of such claims. By 2012, 8 years after the disappearance, the family dynamic had completely changed. Eduardo had graduated from university and was working as a systems analyst for a tourism company in Puerto Vallarta. Alejandro had returned home, but the relationship with Dolores never recovered the intimacy it once had. They lived more like companions in grief than as husband and wife. Dolores had found some peace working as a volunteer with a local organization that helped families of missing persons. This activity gave her a sense of purpose and put her in contact with other mothers who understood exactly what she was going through. During these years, Eduardo had refined his internet search techniques, learned to use basic facial recognition software, and set up automatic alerts that notified him when new photos appeared online that might match Esperanza's physical features. The search had become an integral part of Eduardo's identity. His friends and coworkers knew that every free moment he had was dedicated to looking for his sister. Some people suggested it was time to move on, but Eduardo had decided he would never give up as long as there was technology available that could help in the search. By 2013, 9 years after the disappearance, Eduardo had expanded his search to international social networks, including US, European, and South American platforms. His command of English, which he had specifically learned to expand the search possibilities, allowed him to navigate international missing persons communities. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance was approaching, and Eduardo had decided to make one final, exhaustive effort using all the technological tools available. If this effort produced no results, the family had decided to finally consider the possibility of declaring Esperanza legally dead and try to find some way to close this chapter of their lives. On March 14, 2014, exactly 10 years after Esperanza's disappearance, Eduardo was preparing for what he had decided would be his final internet search. He had taken a 1-week vacation from work with the specific purpose of dedicating every available hour to a systematic and exhaustive review of all possible social networks. Over the years, Eduardo had developed an extremely detailed methodology. He used a combination of facial recognition software obtained through university contacts, advanced search databases, and self-taught digital investigation techniques. His strategy for that week included reviewing not only obvious profiles that might correspond to Esperanza, but also profiles of people who might have information about her, former crew members of the Caribbean Princess, people who had been on the cruise at that time, and families who might have adopted Mexican girls in the years following 2004. Facebook technology had evolved significantly since Eduardo had started his searches. In 2014, the search functions were much more sophisticated, allowing filters by age, location, school, and multiple other criteria that had not been available in previous years. Eduardo had created a list of 347 possible variations of Esperanza's name. Esperanza, Esp, Espy, Hope, its English translation, Opie, and dozens of other variations and nicknames that a teenager might have been using. He had also compiled a list of more than 100 possible surnames, including common surnames of adoptive families in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. The process Eduardo followed was meticulous to the point of being obsessive. Every potential profile was saved in a database with screenshots, notes on physical similarities, information on mutual connections, or geographic locations that might be relevant. On March 15th, after 2 days of intense searching, Eduardo had reviewed more than 3,200 profiles without finding anything promising. Frustration began to build, especially because he felt he was repeating searches he had done in previous years. That's when he decided to change his strategy. Instead of directly searching for Esperanza's name, he began to look for profiles of people who had lived in Puerto Vallarta or who had connections with that city. His theory was that if Esperanza had been taken by someone from the cruise, she might have maintained some geographic connection with Mexico. This new strategy led him to review profiles of people who had worked in Puerto Vallarta's tourism industry, especially those who had jobs related to cruises between 2004 and 2014. Facebook allowed searches by former employer, a function Eduardo had not systematically used in previous searches. On March 16th, Eduardo found the profile of a man named Fernando Aguilar, who had worked as an excursion coordinator for several cruise lines, including Princess Cruises, between 2002 and 2008. Fernando's profile included photos of family events dating back several years. Eduardo began systematically reviewing all the photos on Fernando's profile using facial recognition software to compare them with age progression photos of Esperanza that he had created with the help of forensic specialists. This was a technique he had developed over the last 2 years and had proven useful in quickly discarding profiles that did not match. In a photo of what appeared to be a birthday celebration in 2012, Eduardo noticed a teenage girl in the background. The quality of the photo was not great, but something about the girl's features seemed familiar. He used image enhancement software to examine the facial traits in more detail. The similarity was significant enough to justify deeper investigation. Eduardo began to examine the comments on that specific photo, looking for names of the people who appeared in the image. In the comments, Fernando had tagged several people, including a user whose profile was listed as Paloma Aguilar. He clicked on Paloma Aguilar's profile and immediately felt a surge of adrenaline. The profile picture showed a young woman of about 18 years old who bore an extraordinary resemblance to the age progression projections specialists had created to show what Esperanza would look like at that age. Paloma Aguilar's profile contained information that immediately caught Eduardo's attention. It listed her city of residence as Mérida, Yucatan, and her date of birth as August 15, 1995. If this information was correct, Paloma would be exactly the same age Esperanza would have been in 2014. Even more significant, the profile showed that Paloma had been a high school student in Mérida until 2013, but there was no information about her elementary education or place of birth. For someone who had grown up in Mérida, this absence of early educational information was unusual. Eduardo proceeded to examine every available photo on Paloma's profile, systematically comparing them with photos of Esperanza, using facial reference points he had learned from forensic investigation manuals. The similarities were too numerous to dismiss: the shape of the eyes, the jawline structure, the distinctive shape of the ears, and several birthmarks visible in some of the photos. What most impacted Eduardo was a photo of 2011 of Paloma smiling directly at the camera. The smile was identical to Esperanza's characteristic smile that Eduardo remembered perfectly. It was not just a general resemblance, it was the same specific facial expression his sister had when she was genuinely happy. Eduardo spent the next 6 hours meticulously documenting every similarity he had found. He created a comparative file with photos of Esperanza and Paloma side by side, marking facial reference points and annotating every matching feature. When he finished this initial analysis, Eduardo had documented 23 facial similarity points, a number which, according to the forensic literature he had studied, made it highly probable that they were the same person. However, he knew he needed more evidence before contacting his parents or the authorities. Eduardo proceeded to investigate Paloma's Facebook connections. Her friends were mostly people from Mérida, but she also had connections in other Mexican cities and some contacts in the United States. One connection that particularly caught his attention was with Fernando Aguilar, the former cruise employee in whose photo she had originally appeared.
The relationship between Paloma and Fernando was not clearly defined on Facebook, but they appeared together in multiple family photos over several years. In some photos, Fernando appeared along with a woman Paloma had tagged as Mama Rosa, suggesting that Fernando might be her adoptive father. Eduardo also noticed that Paloma had only started using Facebook in 2010 when she would have been about 15 years old. For a Mexican teenager at that time, starting to use social media at 15 was not unusual, but the complete absence of photos or references to her life before 2010 was notable. Even more intriguing, Eduardo discovered that Paloma had attended a private secondary school in Mérida that was known for accepting students who did not have complete educational documentation from their primary school years. This school had a reputation for working with adoptive families and children who had experienced disruptions in their early education. By the end of March 16, Eduardo had enough evidence to be convinced he had found his sister. However, he also understood the magnitude of what this meant and knew he needed to handle the situation with extreme care. Eduardo spent the night of March 16 sleepless, reviewing again and again the evidence he had compiled. The possibility that he had finally found Esperanza was overwhelming, but also terrifying. 10 years of searching had resulted in dozens of false alarms, and Eduardo knew that the emotional consequences of another disappointment could be devastating for his family. The first decision he had to make was whether to immediately contact his parents or investigate further before giving them what could be false hope. Eduardo decided he needed at least one more piece of evidence before involving Alejandro and Dolores. On March 17, Eduardo implemented a more aggressive research strategy using techniques he had learned from online communities dedicated to searching for missing persons. He began investigating not only Paloma's profile, but also the profiles of everyone connected to her. The investigation into Fernando Aguilar revealed information that corroborated Eduardo's suspicions. Fernando had indeed worked for Princess Cruises during the period that included March 2004. More specifically, the employment records Eduardo accessed through LinkedIn showed that Fernando had worked as a children's activities coordinator on Caribbean cruises during exactly the period when Esperanza had disappeared. Eduardo also discovered that Fernando had had legal troubles in 2005, 1 year after Esperanza's disappearance. He had been arrested in Cancun on charges related to fraudulent documentation, although the charges were later dropped. This information was available in digital newspaper archives that Eduardo found using specialized news database searches. The investigation into Rosa Velasco, the woman Paloma identified as her mother, revealed an even more troubling pattern. Rosa had officially adopted Paloma in 2007, 3 years after Esperanza's disappearance. However, the adoption documents Eduardo was able to partially access through digitized public records showed that Paloma had been living with Rosa since 2004. This timeline was highly suspicious. If Paloma had really been born in 1995 and had been with Rosa since 2004, she would have been with her from the age of 9. Yet there were no official records explaining why a 9-year-old girl would have needed to be placed in adoptive care, nor any records of her original biological parents. Eduardo discreetly contacted a lawyer specializing in missing persons cases to understand the legal implications of what he had discovered. The lawyer warned him that accusing someone of kidnapping without absolute evidence could cause legal problems for Eduardo, but also confirmed that he had enough evidence to justify a formal police investigation. On March 18, Eduardo made the decision to contact Paloma directly through Facebook. He carefully crafted a message that would not alarm her, but could reveal crucial information about her identity. The message Eduardo sent said, "Hi Paloma, I know we don't know each other, but I'm researching people who might have been on a Caribbean cruise in March 2004. I saw that you have connections with people who worked in that industry at that time. Would it be possible for you to help me with some questions about that period? It's for a research project on tourism in Mexico." Eduardo had designed the message to be vague but specific about the relevant dates. If Paloma really was Esperanza, the mention of March 2004 and Caribbean cruises might trigger memories or reactions that would reveal important information. Paloma's response came surprisingly quickly, only 3 hours after Eduardo sent the message. Her reply was, "Hi Eduardo, the truth is, I don't remember much from that time because I was very little, but you can ask me whatever you need. Fernando, who is like my dad, did he work on cruises in those years? This response confirmed several of Eduardo's suspicions. First, Paloma acknowledged that she had been very little in 2004, which was consistent with being 8 years old at that time. Second, she directly confirmed the connection with Fernando and his cruise work. Third, the casual way she described Fernando as like my dad suggested that he was not her biological father. Eduardo decided to push a bit further in his next messages. He asked specifically about memories of ships, Mexican ports, and whether she had lived in different cities as a child. Paloma's answers were vague, but revealed significant details. She mentioned that she had very confusing memories of her early childhood and had lived in several places before permanently settling in Merida around 2007. She also mentioned that she sometimes had dreams about being on a big ship, but that Rosa had told her these were probably just childhood fantasies. The mention of dreams about ships was the detail that definitively convinced Eduardo. During the first weeks after the disappearance, Esperanza had frequently mentioned dreams about ships and the ocean. It was such a specific detail that only someone who had been on the Caribbean Princess cruise could remember it so vividly. Eduardo knew it was time to involve his parents in the authorities. However, he also knew he needed to handle the situation with extreme care. If Paloma really was Esperanza, she had spent 10 years believing Rosa and Fernando were her family. The revelation of the truth would have to be handled in a way that did not further traumatize her sister. On March 19, Eduardo finally decided to contact his parents. He first called his mother, knowing that Dolores would have the most intense emotional reaction, but also the strongest maternal instinct to protect Esperanza during what would be a very difficult process. The phone conversation with Dolores was one of the hardest of Eduardo's life. He had to methodically explain all the evidence he had found, while his mother oscillated between desperate hope and the terror of another false alarm. Eduardo emailed her all the comparative photos he had created, and Dolores immediately confirmed the similarities Eduardo had identified. Dolores agreed that the physical resemblance was too specific to be coincidental, but she also expressed concern about how to proceed without causing more trauma to Esperanza. 10 years had passed. If she really was their daughter, she probably wouldn't remember them, and forcing an encounter could be devastating for everyone involved. Eduardo and Dolores decided to contact federal prosecutor Ricardo Salinas, who had handled the original investigation. Salinas, who now held a higher position in the Attorney General's office, immediately recognized the importance of Eduardo's discovery. He confirmed that he had the legal authority to officially reopen the case and ordered DNA testing to confirm Paloma's identity. However, he also warned that the process would be complex because it would involve coordinating with Yucatan authorities and potentially pressing criminal charges against Fernando and Rosa if it was confirmed they had been involved in the original abduction. The decision of whether to proceed legally versus attempting a direct family approach became the central dilemma the Castillo family had to face. Each option carried significant risks and consequences that could permanently affect any possibility of reunification with Esperanza. On March 20, 2014, Agent Salinas officially authorized the reopening of the Esperanza Castillo case based on the evidence presented by Eduardo. The first phase of the renewed investigation would involve verifying the identity of Paloma without alerting Fernando or Rosa about the investigation. Salinas assigned the case to Special Agent Claudia Ramos, an investigator specializing in human trafficking and missing persons cases. Ramos's experience included multiple cases in which children had been separated from their biological families and had lived for years under false identities. Ramos's initial strategy was to obtain additional information about Paloma and her adoptive family without making direct contact. Using specialized police resources, she was able to access school, medical, and legal records that Eduardo could not obtain through public searches. Paloma's medical records revealed crucial information. Her file showed that she had been treated by a pediatrician in Merida since 2005, but there were no medical records prior to that date. For a girl who would have been 10 years old in 2005, the complete absence of childhood medical records was highly unusual. Even more significant, Paloma's dental records, which Agent Ramos obtained through a court order, showed evidence of dental work performed using techniques and materials characteristic of Mexican dentists in the Puerto Vallarta area during the period 2002 to 2004. The investigation into Paloma's school records revealed more inconsistencies. Although she had attended school regularly in Mérida since 2005, there were no transfer records from any previous institution. School administrators had accepted Paloma based on documentation provided by Rosa, but this documentation included a birth certificate that investigators now suspect might be fraudulent. In parallel, Agent Ramos initiated a deeper investigation into Fernando Aguilar and Rosa Velasco. This investigation revealed a highly suspicious pattern of behavior. Fernando had changed residences multiple times between 2004 and 2007, living in Puerto Vallarta, Cancun, and finally settling in Mérida. Fernando's financial record showed that he had made significant bank transfers in May 2004, 2 months after Esperanza's disappearance.
These transfers, totaling approximately 180,000 pesos, had been sent to a bank account in Mérida, which was later used to purchase the house where Paloma had grown up. The investigation into Rosa Velasco revealed that she had submitted adoption applications in multiple Mexican states during 2004 and 2005, but all of these applications had been withdrawn, except for the one that ultimately resulted in the adoption of Paloma. This pattern suggested that Rosa had been specifically seeking a way to legalize custody of a girl who was already in her possession. On March 25, Agent Ramos had compiled enough circumstantial evidence to justify a direct confrontation. However, the strategy for this confrontation required extreme care due to the psychological sensitivity of the situation. The decision was to contact Rosa Velasco first, as psychological analyses suggested she would be more likely to cooperate than Fernando. Agent Ramos and a psychologist specializing in family reunification traveled to Mérida to conduct the interview. Rosa was contacted at her workplace, a dental clinic where she had worked as an assistant for the past 8 years. When Agent Ramos identified herself and mentioned that she was investigating the case of Esperanza Castillo, Rosa immediately began crying and asked to speak in private. In an interrogation room at the Yucatan prosecutor's office, Rosa confessed that she had known from the very beginning that Paloma was not an orphan, as Fernando had claimed. However, she also revealed that by the time she realized the truth, she had already developed a deep maternal bond with the girl and felt it was too late to change the situation. Rosa explained that Fernando had initially told her that Paloma was the daughter of a woman who had died in an accident and that he had legal custody but could not care for her due to his constant travel for work. Rosa, who had been unable to have biological children, agreed to take care of Paloma temporarily, but Fernando never returned for her. According to Rosa's testimony, she began to suspect something was wrong when Paloma, during her first months with her, repeatedly said she wanted to go home to her mom, dad, and Eduardo. Rosa assumed these were memories from her past life, but chose not to investigate further because she feared losing the girl she had come to love as her own daughter. Rosa also revealed that Fernando had visited regularly during the first years, but these visits stopped completely around 2008. During one of these visits, Fernando threatened to take Paloma away if Rosa ever spoke to the authorities about how the girl had come into her care. Rosa's testimony provided the direct evidence investigators needed to move forward with criminal charges against Fernando. However, it also raised the complex question of how to handle the relationship between Paloma and Rosa, who had effectively been her mother for 10 years. Regardless of the original circumstances, Agent Ramos decided to keep the investigation confidential while Fernando was being located. Rosa was released under the condition that she not contact Fernando or alert Paloma about the investigation until the situation could be managed in a way that minimized trauma for everyone involved. The search for Fernando revealed that he had left Mexico in 2012 and was apparently living in Guatemala, where he had established a tourism business similar to his previous work. Extradition would be possible, but would require international coordination that could take weeks or months. During this period, the Castillo family lived in a state of extreme tension. They knew they had most likely found Esperanza, but they also knew that the reunification process would be complex and potentially traumatic. Dolores, in particular, struggled with conflicting feelings: joy that her daughter was alive, and resentment toward the woman who had raised her daughter for 10 years. Eduardo continued to maintain casual contact with Paloma through Facebook, but now every conversation was charged with an emotional weight he could not express. Knowing that he was speaking with his lost sister without being able to reveal her identity was emotionally exhausting. The final decision on how to proceed had to balance legal, psychological, and family considerations, all equally important and potentially conflicting. On April 2, 2014, Agent Ramos decided that the time had come to confront Paloma directly with the truth about her identity. This decision was made after extensive consultations with psychologists specializing in family reunification and with the approval of the Castillo family. The strategy was designed to minimize psychological trauma while maximizing the chances that Paloma might recall details of her earlier life that would definitively confirm her identity. The encounter would take place in a controlled environment with psychological support immediately available. Paloma was contacted by Rosa, who asked her to accompany her to a routine medical appointment. In reality, they were directed to a government office in Mérida, where Agent Ramos and a team of psychologists were waiting. Rosa had agreed to fully cooperate with this confrontation as part of her testimony. When Paloma arrived at the office and realized it was not a medical appointment, she immediately became anxious and defensive. Agent Ramos began the conversation by explaining that they were investigating the case of a girl who had disappeared 10 years earlier, and that they had reason to believe Paloma might have information that could help. Paloma's initial reaction was one of genuine confusion. She explained that she did not understand how she could have information about a missing girl, since she had lived with Rosa her entire life. But when Agent Ramos specifically mentioned the name Esperanza Castillo and showed her photographs of the family, Paloma felt a visible physical reaction. She began to cry without understanding why, and said the photographs seemed familiar, like from a dream. When she was shown a photograph of Eduardo at 16 years old, Paloma said she had the strange feeling she knew that person, but could not explain from where. The breaking point came when Agent Ramos showed Paloma a home video that the Castillos had filmed during the cruise the day before the disappearance. The video showed Paloma playing in the ship's pool, laughing and speaking with her parents in Spanish with the distinctive accent of Puerto Vallarta. As Paloma watched the video, she began to experience what the psychologists present identified as traumatic memory recovery. She started recalling specific fragments: the taste of the chlorinated pool water, the feel of the ship's deck beneath her feet, her mother's voice calling to her from a distance. Paloma asked to see the video again, and during the second viewing suddenly shouted "Eduardo" upon seeing her brother in the video. At that moment, she began to remember not only Eduardo, but also fragments of her life in Puerto Vallarta, the house that she had lived in, her school, her friends, and especially moments with her family. The memory recovery was not immediate or complete, but it was specific enough to confirm beyond doubt that Paloma was truly Esperanza Castillo. She recalled details that only Esperanza could know: the name of her first-grade teacher, the exact location of a scar on Eduardo's knee, and the specific song Dolores used to sing to her before bedtime. However, Paloma also experienced a severe psychological crisis upon realizing that her entire identity had been a lie for 10 years. The woman she had known as her mother had participated in separating her from her real family, and the man she had known as her father had been responsible for her kidnapping. Rosa, who was present during the confrontation, also began crying and repeatedly begged forgiveness from both Paloma and the investigators. She explained that during the first years she had tried to convince herself that she was protecting Paloma from something worse, but eventually realized she had been complicit in something terrible. Agent Ramos immediately contacted the Castillo family in Puerto Vallarta to inform them that their daughter's identity had been positively confirmed. The phone call with Dolores was a mixture of joy, relief, and anxiety about how to proceed with the reunification. The meeting between Paloma and her biological family was scheduled for the following day, April 3. The decision was to hold it in Mérida, in a neutral environment with psychological support available to everyone. Eduardo was the first family member to travel to Mérida, both because he had been the one to find her and because Paloma had shown the strongest reaction upon remembering him. The reunion between Eduardo and Esperanza was documented by psychologists as one of the most emotionally intense they had ever witnessed. When Esperanza saw Eduardo enter the room, she immediately recognized him as her brother, but also experienced severe emotional confusion as the reality she had known for 10 years had been shattered in just a few hours. Eduardo slowly approached his sister and said, "Hello, Esperanza. I'm Eduardo, your brother. I've been looking for you for 10 years. Esperanza replied, "I know who you are, but I don't understand how any of this is possible. My whole life has been a lie."
The conversation between the siblings lasted 3 hours, during which Eduardo carefully explained everything that had happened since her disappearance, how the family had never stopped searching for her, how it had affected their parents, and how he had dedicated years to developing techniques to find her on the internet. Esperanza also shared fragments of her memories from the decade she had lived as Paloma. She explained that she had generally had a happy childhood with Rosa, who had been a loving mother, but that she had always had the feeling that something was missing in her life. She also mentioned that she had had recurring nightmares about being lost and not being able to find her family, but Rosa had told her they were only dreams. The meeting with Alejandro and Dolores took place on April 4th. This encounter was even more emotionally intense, especially for Dolores, who had preserved Esperanza's room exactly as it had been 10 years earlier. When Dolores saw her daughter for the first time, she immediately recognized her, but she also realized that she was no longer the 8-year-old girl she had lost, but an 18-year-old young woman who had lived an entirely different life. Esperanza had difficulty immediately relating to Alejandro and Dolores as her parents, because Rosa had effectively been her mother for most of her conscious life. However, she also experienced a sense of coming home that she could not rationally explain. The reunification of Esperanza with the Castillo family was not the immediate happy ending many might have expected, but rather the beginning of a complex process of family reconstruction that would take years. Esperanza faced the impossible decision between two families who loved her. Rosa had been her mother for 10 years and had provided love, care, and stability, even if it was based on criminal circumstances. The Castillos were her biological family, who had never stopped searching for her but were effectively strangers. After a decade of separation, the solution that developed was gradual and supervised by professionals. Esperanza continued living in Mérida with Rosa during the first months, but began to spend regular time with the Castillos in Puerto Vallarta. This arrangement allowed both family relationships to continue, while Esperanza psychologically processed the revelation about her identity. The legal case against Fernando Aguilar developed in parallel with the family reunification process. Fernando was arrested in Guatemala in June 2014 and extradited to Mexico in September. During his trial, it was revealed that he had kidnapped Esperanza with the intention of selling her to a childless family, but that Rosa had become so attached to the girl that she paid Fernando to maintain permanent custody.
Fernando was sentenced to 25 years in prison for kidnapping, child trafficking, and conspiracy. Rosa received a suspended sentence and community service due to her cooperation with the investigation and the recognition that she had provided loving care to Esperanza during the decade of separation. One of the most complex aspects of the resolution was handling the ongoing relationship between Esperanza and Rosa. Psychologists determined that completely cutting off this relationship would be traumatic for Esperanza, who had known Rosa as her mother for most of her conscious life. The solution was to allow Rosa to maintain a role in Esperanza's life, similar to that of a godmother or beloved aunt. This decision was initially difficult for Dolores, who struggled with resentment toward the woman who had raised her daughter. However, with intensive family therapy, Dolores came to understand that Rosa had also been, in a certain sense, a victim of Fernando's lies. Eduardo became the family member who most easily re-established his relationship with Esperanza. Their sibling connection was strengthened by the fact that he had been the one to find her, and because their relationship had been the one Esperanza most vividly remembered during the initial confrontation. Esperanza's readaptation to life with the Castillos involved multiple practical adjustments. She had grown up in Mérida, a city significantly different from Puerto Vallarta, and had developed friendships and connections she did not want to completely abandon. The family decided that Esperanza would finish her high school studies in Mérida, but would spend vacations and summers in Puerto Vallarta. Legally, Esperanza officially recovered her original name in October 2014, although she decided to keep Paloma as a second name in honor of the life she had lived during the decade of separation. This decision symbolized her approach of integrating both parts of her experience rather than completely rejecting the years as Paloma. The impact of the case extended beyond the Castillo family. Princess Cruises implemented additional safety protocols as a direct result of the renewed investigation, including more thorough background checks for employees with access to children's areas and better monitoring systems in critical areas of the ship. The story also led to changes in adoption procedures in Mexico, including more rigorous background checks on children being placed for adoption and better communication between states regarding cases of missing minors. For the Castillo family, recovering Esperanza also meant processing 10 years of trauma and loss. Alejandro and Dolores required extensive therapy to cope with complex feelings of joy at their daughter's return, but also pain over the lost years and resentment toward the circumstances that had caused the separation. The marital relationship between Alejandro and Dolores, which had been severely damaged by Esperanza's disappearance, began a process of repair. However, they also had to acknowledge that they had fundamentally changed during the decade of separation and that rebuilding their marriage would require conscious effort. Eduardo decided to change his professional career as a result of his experience finding Esperanza. He specialized in technology applied to the search for missing persons and eventually established a non-profit organization dedicated to helping other Mexican families facing similar situations. Esperanza gradually adapted to having two families and two identities. At 19 years old, in 2015, she made the decision to move permanently to Puerto Vallarta to be closer to the Castillos while maintaining a regular relationship with Rosa. She enrolled at the University of Guadalajara to study psychology, motivated by her own experience of trauma and recovery. In 2016, 2 years after the reunification, Esperanza gave her first public interview about her experience. She explained that she had learned to see her life not as a lost decade, but as a unique experience that had given her perspective on family and human resilience that she otherwise never would have had. The story of Esperanza Castillo became a case study for researchers of childhood trauma and family reunification. Her ability to integrate two seemingly contradictory identities into a coherent life narrative was considered remarkable by mental health professionals. On the 10th anniversary of her reunification in 2024, Esperanza reflected on how the case had affected not only her family,
but also public policies related to missing children in Mexico. Her story had inspired improvements in search systems, investigation protocols, and support for affected families. Rosa Velasco continued living in Mérida and maintained a cordial relationship with the Castillo family. In 2020, when Esperanza's first child was born, Rosa was invited to meet her grandson, symbolizing the complex but ultimately successful integration of the two families who had loved Esperanza. This case also had a lasting impact on the cruise industry. Esperanza's story led to investigations of multiple similar cases where cruise employees had had inappropriate access to minors. Although most of these cases did not involve kidnapping, they led to significant reforms in child protection protocols across the industry. For Eduardo, finding his sister validated a decade of obsessive searching that many people had considered unhealthy. His social media search methodology became a model used by other missing persons organizations and was recognized internationally for its innovation in applying technology to missing persons cases. The Castillo family learned that reunification did not mean a return to the life they had before, but rather the creation of a new family dynamic that incorporated the experiences and growth all of them had undergone during the decade of separation. This case shows us how technology and family perseverance can combine to solve even the most complex mysteries. Esperanza's story also illustrates that families can survive incredible traumas and find ways to rebuild themselves, though never in exactly the same way they existed before. What do you think of this story? Were you able to identify the clues that pointed toward the truth throughout the narrative? Do you think Eduardo did the right thing by continuing his search for so many years? Share your reflections in the comments on how social media has changed the way we search for missing people. If this story impacted you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more real cases like this one. Leave a like if you believe this story demonstrates the power of family love, and share it with someone who may also be interested in real investigation cases.